International Conference on Arts and Humanities.
Magandang hapon po. I'm tempted to just tell stories this afternoon, but of course I have a paper to present. And its title is Being Woman, Empowered Matrons and Damsels Not Quite in Distress in 3 Blaan Folktales. So this paper discusses 3 folktales documented by the author, which is myself, from the Blaan indigenous community in North Cotabato, which is a province in Mindanao, in the southern part of the Philippines. These are 3 of the more popular folktales which have women as their central characters. Young women growing up in domestic environments and in the company of elder women, their mothers, who influence their decisions and their behaviors. The paper explores the dynamics in the relationships between the women and the impact of this phenomenon on their interactions and relationships with the male characters. We have here the map of the Philippines and the research locales in the southern part of the Philippines. As you can see, the red mark over there, that's the island of Mindanao. And Cotabato, or North Cotabato, is only about 180 kilometers from Davao City, where I live, and where the University of the Philippines is. Another picture here at the bottom is that of the Blaan women in their traditional dresses. So this paper aims to scrutinize how female characters are portrayed in 3 folktales from the Blaan tribe. They are shared by native female bards. These 3 folktales, namely Nga Binai, Dilag, the Night Creature, and the Beautiful Maiden, reveal how the storytellers themselves perceive and interpret the roles of women in their tribe. A dominant theme in the folktales focuses on the relationships between mothers and daughters, nieces and aunts, husbands and wives. How the elder women, or the matrons, and the younger women, or the damsels not quite in distress, deal with situations forced on them reflect the merging of traditional and actual characteristics of the women of the Blaan tribe. These 3 folktales are actually among the collected folk literature from the Blaan tribes. So the research made use of the methodology which was, in a way, guided by the principles of Arsenio Manuel. So the following had to be met first before the research was done. So specificity, subject coverage, documentation, folkloricity, and the direct method. So all these were in a way met in the research process. So here are the folktales to give you a very brief overview of what the 3 folktales are all about. The first is Nga Binai. It's a story about a beautiful maiden who lived with her mother in a forest beside a great lake. Nobody had laid eyes on Nga Binai because her mother saw to it that she didn't leave the house except when sent on an errand. She spent most of her time weaving and went out of the house only to find food for her mother, until one day when she was on her way back from her aunt's house asking for food but was refused, a man, described as a young and handsome person, spotted her and eventually followed her home. When interrogated, the maiden's mother denied that there was somebody else in the house and insisted that she lived alone. But the young man did not believe her and came back later with his entire family asking for the young woman's hand in marriage. Meanwhile, the aunt, who had 2 daughters, wanted the young man to marry either one of the daughters. But the young men said they didn't know how to cook and therefore shunned their attention. With his family, the young man, later known as Lagiad Natul, was successful in making Nga Binai's mother agree with his marriage proposal. He then brought mother and daughter to his own kingdom. Later in this story, Lagiad Natul's mother, who turned out to be a goddess, descended from the sky world to scrutinize her son's wife. Satisfied that the young wife indeed met her standards, she brought them with her to her abode in the sky. The next folk tale is about the night creature and the beautiful young woman. Tells about the adventure of a young woman again, who also lived alone with her old mother at the edge of a forest. One night, she was sent by her mother to look for edible frogs for dinner. But despite her fear of the dark, the maiden set off towards the riverbank where she encountered the frightful night creature. She was afraid, but thought of her mother and therefore endured the company of the creature, who offered to help her look for a frog. When she got home, she told her mother what happened. The creature had followed her and demanded that she serve him. The mother mustered enough courage and kept her cool and firmly instructed her daughter to do as the creature said. The creature slept in the maiden's bed that night, and when she woke up, the maiden saw that instead of a fearful creature, a handsome young man was lying beside her. He had transformed into his true form, whose name was Datu Ulo El, the king of the river. With her mother's approval, the young woman married Datu Ulu El, who disguised himself as a night creature in order to find a wife. And the third folk tale is entitled Glag. It documents the story of a young woman again who lived with her widowed mother in a place where two mountains stood. One day, a young man saw her and fell in love with her. He then asked his entire family again to come with him to ask for the young woman's hand for marriage. They eventually got married, and the young husband brought his new bride to his place called Dilag. A few days after the wedding, the man's first wife descended from the sky, demanding proof that the new bride was indeed beautiful and came from the place where two mountains stood. This indeed was true, and the first wife was pleased. She then invited them to come with her to her kingdom in the sky. So we have here the women in the folk tales. First, I'd like to talk about the damsels not quite in distress. Now, in her article, Active Heroines in Folk Tales for Children, she will observe that in most familiar folk tales with female protagonists, the woman or girl plays a passive role, waiting to be rescued, or at most, helping her male rescuer by her special knowledge of her captor. Women with power tend to have secondary roles: wicked stepmother, fairy godmother. This observation is true in the stories of Snow White, Cinderella, and the Sleeping Beauty, where the central female characters had to be rescued by a Prince Charming from the cruelty of the other women, namely the stepmother and, of course, the spurned godmother. So the same observation is expressed in The Damsel in Distress, that the damsel in distress is a stereotype that has often been used in the earliest fairy tales and can still be seen in modern popular culture. The stereotype is a female character, obviously, who finds herself in a situation that requires someone to save her. She is portrayed as helpless, unable to or reluctant to do something about the situation herself. The pursuit of the rescuing of the damsel in distress is often the event that puts the characters and the plot in motion. Now, a significant feature that stands out in all the three folk tales is the key characters. Again, young women living with their mothers. They are described as extraordinarily beautiful, isolated from society, obedient to their mothers, docile and domestic. They do not seem to have any preoccupation but weave all day and leave the house only when sent on an errand by their mothers. At the end of each story, they get to marry young men described as rich, handsome, and related to immortal beings living in the sky world, or are immortal themselves, just like Datu El, who takes the form of a fearful night creature to test his future bride. The young women do not have to contend with life-threatening trials except perhaps for the central character who has to suppress her fear when in the presence of a frightening night creature. Are they in distress? This again is not evident. Each young woman lives with her mother, content to perform domestic tasks such as weaving and preparing food for her. The arrival of the young men in each of their lives propels their stories forward. Unlike in the story of Snow White and the Sleeping Beauty, in particular, the young men in the Blaan Folktales do not have to battle against witches or monsters to rescue the young women. All they do is ask for the permission of and make marriage arrangements with the mothers, and the young women become their wives. No questions asked. Now the readers can either question this seemingly passive nature of the young women or accept this as part of the cultural traditions and practices of the indigenous community, which are above reproach. The young men in the tales do not need to rescue the young women from adversity. Considering their lifestyle, the young women seem content with living with their mothers, even if they are isolated from the rest of society. No desire to escape from a life of monotony is perceived in them. They embrace their fate as long as their mothers assure them that all will be well. They do not even question the reason for their isolation, nor defy their mother's decision to marry them off to young men they know nothing about. Eventually, there is no hint of distress or scorn in them, just acceptance of their fate and confidence in their mother's decisions. In the story about the maiden who encountered the night creature, the young woman is bound by her duty to bring food to her mother so that despite the terror she feels, she struggles to stand her ground until the night creature brings her the food, the edible frogs for her mother. When she gets home, the young woman eventually breaks down but is assured by her mother everything will be all right. And when the night creature comes visiting later that night, the young maiden obeys her mother's instructions, fully trusting her authority and her instincts. But still, the young maiden is far from being distressed or in need of a rescuer. The night creature, who turns out to be the king of the river, does not at all fit the image of the stereotypical Prince Charming. So in these stories, Nga Binai and Dilag, the young women too, are similarly far from being distressed. The young men they end up marrying do not likewise fit the Prince Charming stereotype. They are not the young women's rescuers at all. They are looking for wives and find the perfect matches. And now, the matrons. Older female characters in many fairy tales are either portrayed as evildoers, whose motivation is envy, and always intent on making the lives of the central female characters miserable, or as passive characters controlled by a more aggressive character. The evil stepmother, the witch, the equally cruel elder sisters, or the passive elderly nanny, the good-hearted mother whose death exposes her daughter to the cruelty and envy of the former. These are the common roles the matrons in popular fairy tales take, except for the occasional fairy godmother who possesses supernatural powers that save and protect the central character from some dangers. In the three folk tales, the mothers are the dominant characters, taking charge of their daughters' destinies, making decisions for them, especially on how to deal with men. They are protective of their daughters to the extent that they hide the young women from the outside world. Despite this imposition of authority, the mothers are not portrayed as cruel or demanding. There is no conflict existing between them and their daughters. The tales not only establish the dependence of the young women on their mothers, but also their high regard, respect, and obedience to them. This dynamics is proven to be effective, especially in ensuring a comfortable future for the young women as they marry well-to-do and powerful husbands. Aside from the young women's mothers, two other women appear in the stories of Nga Binai and Dilag. These are the young man's mother in Nga Binai and the young man's first wife in Dilag. Both women appear at the end of the tales. Their goal is to determine whether the wives of their son or the husband meet the criteria they have imposed. They need to be assured their son or the husband has chosen a wife who passes their requirements. In both tales, the young man's mother in Nga Binai and the young man's first wife are satisfied with choices of the men, it is assumed that if both women are displeased, the young wives will meet opposition and probable misunderstandings, which will lead to conflicts in their relationship with their in-laws. But despite this, the mother-in-law and the first wife are not portrayed as cruel or over-imposing. And so the tales have happy endings. Now what the folk tales tell, the Blaan, like most indigenous communities in the Philippines, are patriarchal in their social, political, and domestic systems. In the family, it is the elder males who are dominant. So Carino observes that indigenous women find themselves living within traditional and largely patriarchal societies. They are expected to serve her father, her mother, her husband, and her in-laws in some cases. This system is actually evident in the three folk tales. However, the matrons or the matriarchs of each family are accorded with high respect, even by the dominant males. In fact, the home is the women's turf. Whatever she does and says is viewed as important. The future of her children is among her responsibilities, and she takes this duty seriously, for she is accountable for the kind of lives they will live and the kind of individuals they will become. The folk tales are not only for entertainment. They most importantly embody the customs, the belief systems, and the traditions of the indigenous community or the tribe where they originate. They are likewise vehicles of the values that the elders intend to imbue in the younger generation. And who can best relay this but the women? That is why the bards and the storytellers in most indigenous communities are women. And when they tell stories about women, they're actually talking about themselves. By relating the folk tales this way, the female bards or the storytellers are actually highlighting their own capacities as women. In a male-dominated society, the women assert their significance, their important roles, and demand and eventually earn the respect that they deserve.